When most people hear the word Jewish, they picture someone from New York or maybe Eastern Europe. They imagine Yiddish, bagels, and black hats. But here is something that might surprise you. For most of Jewish history, the majority of Jews in the world did not live in Europe at all. They lived in Baghdad and Babylon, in the mountains of Kurdistan and the deserts of Yemen, in the ancient cities of Persia and the bustling markets of Aleppo. They are called the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews of the East, and their story is one of the oldest, most remarkable, and most overlooked chapters in all of Jewish history. These are communities that trace their origins not to medieval Europe, but to the very beginning of the Jewish story itself. Some of them have lived continuously in the Middle East for over 2,600 years, predating Islam by more than a millennium and Christianity by more than 5 centuries. They created the Babylonian Talmud, the single most important text in Rabbinic Judaism. They led Jewish scholarship for nearly 1,000 years. And then, in the span of just a few decades in the 20th century, almost all of them vanished from the lands they had called home for millennia. This is the true story of where Mizrahi Jews came from, what they built, and what happened to the oldest Jewish communities on Earth. If you love Jewish stories, make sure you subscribe to Jews Chronicles. What does Mizrahi actually mean? The word Mizrahi comes from the Hebrew word Mizrach, which simply means east. It is a relatively modern term, coined largely after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, to describe Jewish communities from the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. But here is the irony. Many of the Jews who get called Mizrahi today never used that word to describe themselves before they arrived in Israel. The Jews of Baghdad called themselves Bavlim, Babylonian Jews. The Jews of Yemen simply called themselves the Congregation. Kurdish Jews had their own identity. Persian Jews had theirs. Bukharian Jews had theirs. The term is really an umbrella label that groups together incredibly diverse communities under a single heading. It includes Iraqi Jews, Iranian Jews, Yemenite Jews, Kurdish Jews, Bukharian Jews from Central Asia, Mountain Jews from the Caucasus, Georgian Jews, Afghan Jews, and sometimes the Jews of Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. Those communities often overlapped with Sephardi Jews who arrived after the 1492 expulsion from Spain. In the Israeli rabbinate, Mizrahi Jews are placed under the authority of the Sephardi chief rabbi, which has further blurred the lines between the two groups. But genetically, historically, and culturally, Mizrahi communities are distinct. Many of them were established centuries, and in some cases millennia, before the Sephardi diaspora even began. So what unites them? Geography and history. These are the Jewish communities that remained in or near the ancient heartlands of the Middle East, while Ashkenazi Jews moved into Europe and Sephardi Jews built their golden age in Spain. They are, in a very real sense, the Jews who stayed closest to home. The oldest and most historically significant Mizrahi community traces its roots to one of the most traumatic events in ancient Jewish history, the Babylonian exile. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, conquered the kingdom of Judah, and deported approximately 40,000 Jews to Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. You might expect that a conquered and exiled people would simply fade away. That is what happened to most ancient peoples who were deported by empires. But the Jews of Babylon did something extraordinary. They did not just survive, they thrived. They built homes, planted gardens, established businesses, and maintained their religious identity with a fierce determination that would define Jewish survival for millennia to come. We even have archaeological evidence of this. Over 100 cuneiform clay tablets discovered in Iraq record the everyday activities of Jewish exiles, including land leases, tax payments, inheritance divisions, and business transactions. Nearly 40% of the individuals mentioned bear distinctly Israelite names that reference the God of Israel. These were not people who had given up their identity. These were people who carried it with them into exile and refused to let it go. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE and issued his decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem, something remarkable happened. Many Jews chose to stay. They had built lives in Babylon, and they had thriving communities. While some returned to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, a large portion of the Jewish population remained in Mesopotamia. This decision created what would become the most intellectually powerful Jewish community in all of history. It also established a pattern that would repeat itself across the Mizrahi world for millennia. Jewish communities did not merely endure in the lands of the Middle East. They planted roots so deep that even the rise and fall of entire empires could not dislodge them. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, as the Jewish population in the land of Israel declined under Roman and Byzantine rule, the center of Jewish scholarship shifted decisively eastward to Babylon. The great academies of Sura and Pumbedita in Mesopotamia became the Harvard and Oxford of the Jewish world, attracting the finest minds and producing the most authoritative legal rulings for centuries. And it was in these academies that the Babylonian Talmud was compiled, a monumental work completed around the 5th century CE that would become the foundational text of Rabbinic Judaism. The Talmud did not merely record laws. It preserved centuries of legal debate, ethical reasoning, storytelling, and theological reflection in a way that no other ancient text had ever attempted. To this day, when a yeshiva student anywhere in the world opens the Talmud, they are studying a text created by Mizrahi Jews in what is now Iraq. After the Talmud was completed, the heads of the Babylonian academies, known as the Geonim, became the supreme religious authorities for Jewish communities worldwide. From roughly the 6th through the 11th centuries, the Geonic period saw Babylonian rabbis answering legal questions sent from Jewish communities as far away as Spain, North Africa, and France. For over 500 years, the Jewish world looked to Mizrahi scholars in Mesopotamia for guidance on virtually every aspect of religious life. This is a history that deserves to be far more widely known. When people speak of Jewish intellectual achievement, they often point to European universities in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the tradition of Jewish learning was built, refined, and institutionalized in the Middle East by Mizrahi Jews 1,000 years earlier. The Mizrahi world was never just about Iraq. Across the Middle East and Central Asia, distinct Jewish communities developed their own traditions, languages, and ways of life, each one a world unto itself. The Jews of Persia, modern-day Iran, claim a history nearly as old as the Babylonian community. The biblical book of Esther is set in the Persian capital of Susa, and Jews have lived continuously in Iran since at least the time of Cyrus the Great. Persian Jews developed their own dialect of Judeo-Persian and maintained a vibrant communal life for over 2,500 years. Even today, Iran is home to one of the last remaining Jewish communities in the Muslim world. The Yemenite Jews are perhaps the most enigmatic of all Mizrahi communities. Their own traditions claim that they arrived in Yemen during the time of King Solomon, making their community potentially 3,000 years old. What makes Yemenite Jews particularly fascinating to scholars is how isolated they remained for centuries, living at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, largely cut off from other Jewish communities. They preserved pronunciations of Hebrew, liturgical melodies, and religious customs that many scholars believe represent the oldest continuous practices in the entire Jewish world. Their pronunciation of Hebrew, for instance, preserves distinctions between certain letters that were lost in every other Jewish community centuries ago. The Kurdish Jews, known in their own language as the Laklucha, lived in the mountainous regions spanning modern Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. They spoke a Jewish dialect of Neo-Aramaic, making them one of the last communities on earth to still speak a living descendant of the language that Jesus spoke, and that much of the Talmud was written in. The Bukharian Jews of Central Asia, centered in the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand in modern Uzbekistan, developed a culture along the ancient Silk Road, speaking Bukhari, a Jewish dialect of Tajik Persian. The mountain Jews of the Caucasus, living in what is now Azerbaijan and Dagestan, spoke Juhuri, a language related to Persian, and built a fiercely independent community in some of the most rugged terrain in the region. And the Georgian Jews maintained their own traditions dating back to at least the 4th century BCE. Each of these communities was distinct. Different languages, different foods, different clothing, different local customs. But they all shared something fundamental, an unbroken connection to the Jewish faith, a memory of the ancient homeland, and a way of life that blended Middle Eastern and Jewish identity naturally and without contradiction. Being Jewish and being Middle Eastern was not a tension for these communities. It was simply who they were. If you love Jewish stories, make sure you subscribe to Jews Chronicles. What DNA reveals? In recent decades, genetic studies have provided powerful confirmation of what Mizrahi Jews have always known about themselves. Large-scale genome research, including landmark studies published by Harry Oster and others, has shown that Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, and Sephardi Jews are all more closely related to each other genetically than any of them are to their non-Jewish neighbors. All three groups share a common Middle Eastern ancestral origin. What is particularly striking about Mizrahi Jews is that, unlike Ashkenazi Jews who show significant European admixture, particularly on the maternal side, Mizrahi Jews tend to show Middle Eastern ancestry on both their paternal and maternal lines. Iraqi and Iranian Jews in particular trace their maternal lineages back to a small number of Middle Eastern women, suggesting that these communities experienced far less intermarriage with surrounding populations than their European counterparts. Genetic analysis has also confirmed that the divergence between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews occurred approximately 2,500 years ago, which aligns perfectly with the historical record of the Babylonian exile. The DNA tells the same story as the ancient texts. A single people was split by exile and empire, with one branch remaining in the Middle East and another eventually making its way to Europe. Despite 25 centuries of separation, the genetic connection between these groups remains clearly detectable. For centuries, Mizrahi communities weathered conquests, empires, and political upheavals, but nothing prepared them for what happened in the 20th century. In the span of just a few decades, Jewish communities that had existed for over 2,000 years essentially ceased to exist in the Arab and Muslim world. Before 1948, approximately 800,000 Jews lived in Arab countries. By the 1970s, the overwhelming majority were gone. Iraq, home to a Jewish community for 2,600 years, was reduced from roughly 150,000 Jews to virtually zero. Yemen saw nearly all of its 50,000 Jews leave. Egypt's 60,000 to 80,000 Jews were expelled in waves. Libya, Syria, and Lebanon saw their communities disappear almost entirely. The causes were multiple. Rising Arab nationalism, the influence of Nazi ideology in some quarters, the creation of Israel in 1948, and subsequent Arab-Israeli wars all contributed to a climate of escalating hostility. In Iraq, the Farhud pogrom of 1941 saw mobs attack the Jewish quarter of Baghdad, killing nearly 200 people. After 1948, Iraqi Jews had their citizenship revoked and their assets frozen. From 1950 to 1952, Operation Ezra and Nehemiah airlifted nearly the entire Iraqi Jewish community to Israel, roughly 120,000 people who were forced to abandon everything they owned. Similar stories played out across the region. Operation Magic Carpet airlifted approximately 49,000 Yemenite Jews to Israel. In Egypt, waves of expulsion followed the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the Six-Day War of 1967. The total property confiscated from departing Jews across the Arab world has been estimated at roughly 40,000 square miles, an area 5 times the size of Israel. These losses have never been compensated, and the human cost, the severing of communities from homelands they had inhabited since the time of the Babylonian kings, the loss of languages that had been spoken for centuries, the abandonment of synagogues and cemeteries and family homes that had been passed down for generations, is incalculable. Ancient synagogues stand empty in Baghdad today. Historic Jewish quarters in Cairo and Damascus are museums of absence. A way of life that had endured for 26 centuries was dismantled in a single generation. The history of Mizrahi Jews challenges almost everything most people think they know about the Jewish world. It challenges the assumption that Jewish history is primarily a European story. It challenges the idea that Jews are outsiders in the Middle East. And it challenges the narrative that Jewish identity is defined solely by the Ashkenazi experience that dominates Western media and popular culture. For the vast majority of recorded Jewish history, the center of Jewish life, learning, and creativity was not in Europe. It was in the Middle East, in communities that spoke Arabic, Persian, Kurdish, and Aramaic. in cities like Baghdad and Isfahan and Sana'a and Aleppo. These communities created the Talmud. They preserved the oldest forms of Hebrew prayer and pronunciation. They maintained a continuous Jewish presence in the lands of the Bible for over 2,600 years. When these communities were uprooted, the world lost something irreplaceable. But the people survived. They carried their traditions, their recipes, their melodies, and their memories to new homes. Today, approximately 45% of Jewish Israelis identify as Mizrahi or Sephardi, making them the demographic backbone of the country. And a new generation is reclaiming this heritage, insisting that the full tapestry of Jewish history, Eastern and Western alike, be remembered and honored. Because to understand the Jewish people, you cannot only look west, you must also look east, to Babylon and beyond, where the story began and where, for 26 centuries, it never stopped being told. If you love Jewish stories, make sure you subscribe to Jews Chronicles. Shalom.